This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. As we get closer to Halloween, I truly cannot wait to see how many of you dress up like me. Just don't forget the bags under the eyes, the iron but unwashed button downs with a few stray cat hairs, and pants are optional. Really, I'm already flattered. Tonight, we've got answers to some of the questions you might be asking about holiday parties and COVID-19 and how to keep friends and family safe. Plus, in the final stretch of a huge election year, we've got some insight on just how much the polls can tell us. But first, here's what you need to know right now. Silicon Valley CEOs testified in front of the Senate Commerce Committee earlier today in what was billed as a discussion to ask whether Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act enables, quote, big tech bad behavior. It largely turned into a discussion about perceived censorship against conservatives, with Republican lawmakers taking swings at Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg and Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey.
Mr. Dorsey, who the hell elected you and put you in charge of what the media are allowed to report and what the American people are allowed to hear?
We're not doing that. And this is why I opened this hearing with calls for more transparency.
Quick FYI, Section 230 gives internet platforms liability protections for how they choose to moderate content. Republican members of the Senate Judiciary Committee initially compelled the CEOs from Twitter, Facebook, and Google to testify by voting for them to be subpoenaed if they refused to drop by. This was set in motion partly by a report from the New York Post on Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, a report that was widely debunked and was flagged by Twitter and Facebook as a part of its crackdown on election disinformation. For their part, Democrats pushed the tech CEOs on questions about extremism and disinformation, while some questioned the motives of Senate Republicans for having this hearing so close to an election.
I want to note first that this hearing comes 6 days before Election Day, and it makes, I believe we're politicizing, and the Republican majority is politicizing, which should actually not be a partisan topic.
If you feel like you've seen these CEOs on Capitol Hill pretty often, it's because they've been in the hot seat a lot. Today marks the 5th time Zuckerberg has appeared before lawmakers and the 3rd time for Dorsey and Sundar Pichai from Google. All this week, we've been talking about a rising COVID-19 surge that has a record number of Americans testing positive and hospitalized with the virus. The pandemic's biggest impacts have been on health and safety and on the people struggling to just put food on the table during this economic crunch. But one part of COVID's economic impact is how it's affecting the stock market and all the savings, retirement funds, and investments Americans have tied into stocks, and they have not been faring well lately. The S&P 500 has fallen about 5% this week, with stocks on a steady decline throughout this whole month of October as case numbers climb and Congress remains gridlocked on an economic relief package. Uncertainty around the election isn't helping either. Earlier this month, Goldman Sachs analysts estimated a split result, with the presidency and Senate split between parties, would likely result in a worse economic outlook, while a Democratic sweep of the presidency, Senate, and House would mean faster recovery, with Democratic lawmakers primed to spend more in pandemic aid. The Los Angeles Dodgers hoisted the Commissioner's Trophy Monday night after beating the Tampa Bay Rays 3-1 and winning 4 games to 2 to snag their first World Series championship since 1988. There are a novel's worth of storylines to follow with this win, but last night, Rays manager Kevin Nash's decision to take out pitcher Blake Snell in the 6th inning proved to be the wrong one. The Dodgers scored 2 runs on reliever Nick Anderson after Snell came out. We would spend a bit more time on the intricacies of the game itself, but how the pandemic affected this World Series and how it can still affect players, staff, and fans overshadows this whole thing a bit. For one, Dodgers third baseman Justin Turner was pulled late in the game because of a positive COVID test. Teams had been in neutral site bubbles for the playoffs, and Turner was the first player to be flagged for the coronavirus since the playoffs began. But all that didn't stop Turner from really taking in the celebration almost as if it were normal times. And fans across the city took to the streets to celebrate despite warnings that there is widespread community transmission in Los Angeles County. This is the city's second major professional sports league championship this year, with the LA Lakers beating the Miami Heat to win their 17th championship in franchise history just earlier this month. The election ain't the only spooky date marked on a calendar for the next week. Halloween and Dia de los Muertos are also just around the corner. And honestly, if you haven't found a way to incorporate a mask into your fit, you are tripping. But seriously, there are risks involved with activities related to these holidays. So what does the CDC say about these holidays and how can people celebrate them safely? Newsy's Amber Strong explains.
Unfortunately, we are still in the thick of this pandemic.
This Halloween, the CDC put an axe to door-to-door trick-or-treating, hay rides, and indoor costume parties, labeling the activities high risk.
Anytime you have mixing of people from different households, even if it is relatively brief, that is a situation where infection can be transmitted.
There you go. Some parents have come up with tricky alternatives. Candy manufacturer Reese's has turned to robotics for safe distribution. But if you don't have the engineering skills to create a mechanical arm, the question of what to do can leave parents and families feeling frustrated.
Thinking of it only as what you're missing out on, what we're not doing, what we can't do, really sets both parents and kids, frankly, up for a lot of disappointment.
Instead, experts say think of the aspects you love most about that holiday and then find ways to make that safe.
My 4-year-old and I will be setting up a table for friends in the neighborhood. We'll be putting candy. We'll be putting up colorful signs.
Having a scavenger hunt or hiding candy around your house or in your own backyard would be considered a safe activity.
Following Halloween night is Dia de Muertos, a Mexican holiday in celebration of All Saints and All Souls Day. But COVID-19 has hit the Hispanic community particularly hard. Some are essential workers, others have limited access to health care, or just a mistrust of the medical community, all leading to a greater health disparity. Health experts say when it comes to El Dia de Muertos, sharing ofrendas virtually or visiting grave sites with members of your household is low to moderate risk. Indoor gatherings are high risk.
While we want to honor these beautiful cultures, these beautiful, beautiful moments in cultures that we value and should be valuing in this country equitably, right? That we do not want to see that result in any more suffering and certainly not in any more deaths.
While things may be different, experts say there are still ways to make the holidays memorable.
Consider this year as maybe a year to start some new traditions and enjoy some new activities that maybe you haven't done as a family before.
Amber Strong, Newsy.
When you're back, we're going to lay out some elections numbers we're pretty sure you haven't seen before. In fact, I haven't seen them, so I need to brush up right quick. Whether you're just caught in the occasional White House horse race numbers on TV or, like us, you're obsessively hitting refresh on the 538 elections forecast page every day, all day, you've probably seen a good bit of polling over the last few months. Polls operate with a margin of error, and sometimes some pretty big twists can come within those margins. See 2016. But there's still no better way to get a true snapshot of how the public feels about one question or another. So, as we often do, this week we partnered with our pals over at Ipsos to survey Americans on a range of topics. Let's break down a few key findings here. Only 41% of Americans say they are confident that we will have a peaceful transition period between Election Day and the beginning of the next presidential term in January, regardless of who wins. Here's a closer look at the answers we got on this. A larger number, 45%, say they are not confident, while quite a few folks just aren't sure what to think. The low confidence really underscores just how uncivil this election has been, with a sitting president making clear he won't go easily even if he loses.
The only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged. Remember that.
Who would you like me to condemn? White supremacists and Proud Boys. Stand back and stand by.
Our survey confidence in a peaceful transition was pretty low across the board, but especially low among Democrats. Only 1 in 5 Americans actually expect a presidential winner to be announced on election night, November 3rd. What with a pandemic and a surge of mailed ballots, election analysts have been predicting it'll take some time to count all the votes, maybe even days or weeks depending on the state, meaning it's unlikely we'll have an accurate idea of the winner next Tuesday. Most Americans do expect we'll know the winner at some point within 1 week after Election Day, with the plurality saying they expect final results coming about a week later, and at least some people saying they don't think we'll know until a month or 2 months on. These predictions of a week-long election count are notable, especially given some buzz around the Supreme Court and a recent note from Justice Brett Kavanaugh that seemed to suggest he expected states to know the legitimate winner the night of, something that contradicts expectations from both the experts and the voters. A full 2/3 of Americans tell us that the presidential debates and town halls had zero impact on their support of a presidential candidate. So you're saying all of this was for nothing?
We're moving a bat hits you over the head, that's not an idea.
To break this down a bit further, 15% of Americans did say the debates actually had a major impact on their vote, whereas 18% said they were a minor influence in choosing a candidate. Still, the vast majority were totally unmoved one way or another by the debates. That kind of stat is noteworthy, especially in a year with a lot of conversation around the format of these debates and what value they provide when the debates can so easily become a platform for pure political spin over substance. Polling is a solid way to gauge how people feel on a range of issues, or in an election season, how they feel about the candidates themselves. Polling isn't a precise prediction of what's going on. You'll need a crystal ball and a hooded figure for that. With the election less than a week away and the polling mistakes from 2016 fresh in our minds, Newsy's Andrew Rafferty tells us how we should view polling this time around.
I'm winning in a landslide. What kind of polls are these?
Winning, losing, or within the margin of error, polling misfires of 4 years prior loom large over the final days of the 2020 presidential race.
I don't care about the polls. There were a whole bunch of polls last time. Didn't work out.
So to get a sense of how voters should view the polling this time around, Newsy spoke with 3 of the nation's top polling organizations about what, if anything, is different now.
Are voters right now right to be skeptical of what they're seeing in the polls based on what happened 4 years ago?
Voters should always be skeptical of anything that presents itself as a precise prediction. And that's not what polls are. What they should be is have a healthy dose of uncertainty when they look at polls.
Nationally, the 2016 surveys actually turned out pretty accurate. Final polling had Clinton with about a 3-point lead, and she ended up winning the popular vote by 2. It was Clinton's lead in state polling in places that ended up being critical in deciding the election where things got off track.
It turned out that the mistakes were unfortunately in places that really mattered. The 3 Midwestern states that Democrats have relied upon in recent elections to, get them over the top, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania.
Now Joe Biden supporters have heartburn, again seeing a Democratic nominee with a comfortable national lead over Donald Trump that is closer in battleground states, albeit a lead larger than Hillary Clinton had at this point in the race.
And how do Americans feel about the polls? Well, we polled it. A Newsy Ipsos survey found 46% of respondents do not feel the polls will accurately predict the winner of the presidential election.
Fewer than half say that they are confident that the polls will get it right this time. And there's an interesting partisan split here. Democrats tend to be more confident in the polls than Republicans do.
That may not be a surprise given President Trump's, in some cases, justified attacks on polls and how the media portrays them, but experts say there are some reasons for optimism we can avoid a 2016 repeat.
It's not like we've been, asleep for the last 4 years doing nothing.
For one, giving more weight to white voters without college degrees that broke strongly for President Trump in his first election. Another, in some of those Midwestern states that weren't really high on the radar 4 years ago, there wasn't that much good polling. That seems to have improved.
I do think there's a better quality polling going on in the critical states.
There's still a lot polls, no matter how accurate, can't control, like a significant late swing towards one candidate, which happened in 2016, or surprise state results, or this year, it's the impact of the coronavirus.
There's a great deal of uncertainty this time around.
The process of voting itself is so different this year that we don't know if a lot of votes will not be counted or people won't show up on election day. So those things suggest that it's within that margin that Donald Trump could potentially squeak out another win.
Andrew Rafferty, Newsy, Washington.
I know a thing or two about polling misfires. In fact, before the show started, a certain number of people found me extremely unlikable as a show host. Oh, y'all thought I forgot? During the final presidential debate, President Trump said that we're rounding the corner when it comes to the coronavirus and that it's going away. We all would love to see that, but that's just not true. The US is now averaging more daily COVID cases than at its previous peak in July. Newsy's Lindsay Thies reports that hospitals are making necessary preparations and more deaths may follow.
Hospitals are bracing for another surge of COVID-19 patients. In parts of Texas, COVID-19 hospitalizations have roughly quadrupled in just a few weeks.
It's not good. It's serious. We're going to need another 200 plus hospital rooms.
In Utah, the State Hospital Association is warning about rationing care as ICU beds run low.
We have the PPE we need to protect our staff. We just don't have enough people.
The U.S. is now averaging more new COVID-19 cases every day than our previous peak in July. Hospitalizations lag behind cases, but they're rising and likely to keep going up too.
Overall, we are seeing less sick people and lesser case fatality rate, which is good.
We spoke with two doctors treating hospitalized COVID patients. Dr. Rohini Sharma is an infectious disease specialist in Denver, Colorado, and Dr. Ben Singer, a pulmonary critical care specialist in Chicago, Illinois. They say now more patients are younger and have a better chance of surviving the virus. Treatments have also improved.
I'm really interested in what your experience has been like and how that was in March and April versus, again, now several months later.
This was an unknown animal to start off with. As soon as studies came in with more data, there were hundreds of studies from China, from US, from Europe, and that helped us improve on our treatment modalities.
We've learned new things about how to treat COVID and how not to treat COVID. So avoiding the use of medications like hydroxychloroquine. We know that steroids like dexamethasone for select patients can play a role in improving their outcomes.
The FDA approval of antiviral drug remdesivir, shown to lower the number of days a COVID patient spends in the hospital, is another step too. Both doctors warn with new COVID cases and hospitalizations climbing, an uptick in deaths is usually what comes next. They say it's important to mind the public health guidance we've been hearing all along: distance, wash your hands, and wear a mask.
Till we have a vaccine, I would say a mask is a poor man's vaccine till then.
Lindsay Thies, Newsy, Denver.
If you haven't already, hit us up on Twitter using the hashtag NewsyInTheLoop. The more engagement I get, the bigger my head gets. I haven't outgrown any baseball caps yet, so let's keep the positive reinforcement coming. Throughout this pandemic, Scripps national reporters have brought you stories that humanize the hardships brought on by this pandemic. And migrants working farms and ranches have felt that too. National reporter Dan Grossman shows us how the struggles they've experienced are trickling down into local communities.
In the trickle-down nature of economics,
it's hard.
What affects migrant workers like David Perez?
This year is one the historians will love, and a year we'll be glad to end.
Affects farmers like Bruce Talbot.
So we depend on them.
Which in turn affects community organization directors like Carolyn Dunn.
We get the good harvest yesterday.
But we start with David. A man who's just thankful he wasn't cut from his job like so many others on the peach farm where he has worked in Palisade, Colorado for the last 24 years.
It's hard to stay, far away from the family, but that's the way.
David works here on an H-2A visa, which allows him legal residence for certain working months without becoming a citizen. It offers him a living that supports his wife and 5 children who live just outside of Mexico City.
They don't have enough way to get money, just me.
But once the pandemic hit, others weren't as fortunate, as this farm that normally supplies 50 migrant workers with a living wage was forced to cut its workforce to 8.
Some guys ended up going back home against their will. Others chose to go back home. Our guys really like working here.
For the farmer's manager, Bruce Talbot, the decision was not easy. The pandemic slashed demand from restaurants and farmers markets he relies on for business, but had to close, forcing Talbot to let go of most of his workers.
A good number of the guest workers
It has led to a busy last few months for Carolyn Dunn, who works as the executive director of Palisades Child and Migrant Services.
The gentleman who just called told me, looks like my work is over for this season, and I'd like to come by and get a meal.
Since March, her organization has supplied migrant workers with free meals and hand sanitizer while also pitching in on rent, utilities, and food for groceries.
I forecast a lot of belt tightening and struggling, honestly, to keep bills paid.
Here and in other communities with similar workforces, the effects are felt in local stores, as migrant workers can make up to 20% of the population during harvest season, bringing money to the local economy.
Our local grocery store has made the comment that if we have a peach crop, he has a profitable year. If we don't have a peach crop, he breaks even.
In a year where everyone has been forced to make cuts to their budget, the struggle only continues to trickle down. I'm Dan Grossman.
A record 32 million Latinos are expected to vote in this upcoming election, the largest racial or ethnic minority of the electorate for the first time. And while that group is more likely to vote for Democrats, they aren't a monolith, and most Cuban Americans vote for Republicans. This election, President Trump is gaining even more support among Cuban Americans than he had in 2016. Newsy's Ben Chamizo explains why.
Cuban American Dayami Montejo says she's voting for President Trump because she fears Joe Biden could turn the U.S. into a communist country.
United States can end up one day like Cuba. That was the way Fidel started in Cuba, telling the young people that they're not going to have to pay for the school.
Montejo came to the U.S. in 1995. Now a mother and business owner in Miami, she says she trusts President Trump to save the nation from progressive Democrats.
He's really aggressive, and he says whatever he needs to say in front of anyone. I will go for Trump.
President Trump appears to be gaining support among Cuban Americans in the Sunshine State. In 2016, he received about half of their votes. This year, nearly 60% say they will vote for him, according to a recent Florida International University poll. So what's behind the gain?
Cuban American voters respond to leadership.
Guillermo Grenier has managed the Cuban American survey for 30 years.
Whoever's in Washington is kind of drumming the drum, is setting the parameters for the narrative.
President Trump's re-election narrative centers on false claims that Biden is anti-police and supports socialism. That rhetoric has hit a nerve among exiles in Miami who have been flooded with political ads and misinformation.
Biden ha dejado clarísimo que él es la marioneta de los chavistas.
If everybody's saying it, then it must be true. And that's why they've had an enormous success with that messaging. It gets reinforced.
Pollsters say the dominance of the Republican narrative in Miami helps explain why recent Cuban arrivals are the president's most ardent supporters. According to the university's poll, 76% of Cubans who arrived between 2010 and 2015 are registered Republicans.
What you see is a very active Republican Party, and new Cubans coming in find that if they sign up for that, their voice resonates very broadly in the Cuban community.
Cuban Americans are the largest Hispanic voting group in Florida, making up around 6% of the state's total voting population. But it's unclear whether they could alone tip the ultimate swing state to the president. Ben Chamizo, Newsy.
That's it for us, folks. As always, thanks for watching. We'll be back with more In the Loop tomorrow. Same time, same place. More top stories from Newsy are headed your way right now.